Amen. A beautiful reminder that this Christmas season is not just about the presents or the gifts or the tree. It is about God sending us his love in the form of his Son. This love that motivated this great rescue mission called Jesus Come to Earth. We've been in the middle of this Advent season. We've seen a great light from the prophet Isaiah. And we've talked about that for a few weeks now. And today we come to one of the more challenging and difficult aspects of Advent, which is why God did it in the first place and what it cost him. And so to open with this, I wanted to try to put this in terms that perhaps you and I can access. So I wanted to go all the way back when our family became the family that we know it as, when our daughter was born many, many years ago. For the very first time, we took a little family vacation with just the four of us. This was our new family, and we were all getting used to this little girl who was now a part of our life and would change it forever. And our son was getting used to being a big brother, and we were getting used to being parents of two. So we could still play man-to-man defense. We were not, and we didn't need to go to zone. But it was just a really amazing time. So when Jael was about 2 months old, we went on a little tiny family vacation. It was super fun. And we're playing in the pool, and we're just at this hotel, and it was really nice. And it was just good to just be together and rest kind of after that and just get to know each other as a family and just kind of celebrate this. And there was this moment where after a fun day of playing, our daughter, who splashed in the water, and she just passed out in her stroller, just completely passed out. And her brother, who was 2.5 at the time, Justice, walks over to her. He was very little, much littler than he is now. And he looks at her, and he looks at her, and he goes, "Pretty sister." And he just strokes her cheek. And my wife's heart just melts, right? Because this is what she wants. She wants her children to get along. She wants to have the brother-sister relationship that was so beautiful and healed. I'm an only child. I don't understand that, but I guess it's not always that way. Some people say. Anyway, so that's just, your heart just melted. Pretty sister. And he just kind of stroked her cheek. And then he just takes his fist and goes, bam, and just hits her right in the face, just right in the nose. And his sister wakes up and is like, ah! She starts crying, as you would if someone punched you right in the face when you were sleeping. And my wife immediately picks up Jael and starts comforting her. I pick up my son, mostly because I'm afraid of what my wife will do to him. It's like, I brought you into this world, boy, I will take you out. And so I'm like, what is going on? And then Justin starts crying. I think he's like, ah! And I'm like, what are you doing? So, I don't know what to do. So I'm like, you are in timeout. So I take him into the bathroom of this little hotel, and I put him there, and I sit him there on I bring a chair in from the kitchen, and I sit him in the chair, and I'm like, you will sit here, and you will think about what you have done. And I closed the shower curtain because I didn't want him looking at any interesting tile patterns. Just think about what you've done. And I put him in there, and I go out, and I try to comfort Jael. And Nicole's got her back to sleep, and we promised, oh, look, we're going to ground your brother until he's in high school. And that made her feel a little better. And so I'm there, my son's crying from the bathroom. Yeah. I'm like, you better cry. And I'm like, and then it gets a little quiet in the bathroom, and I'm like, he's thinking. He is thinking in his 2.5-year-old heart about what he has done. He is reflecting on the error of his ways, how violence malforms us as humans. He's thinking about what he has done and what kind of person he is becoming. He is repenting in that bathroom, learning, growing. We are good parents indeed. And so then it gets real quiet for way too long. And I'm like, something's not right. So I kind of peek my head into the bathroom, and this is what I see in that hotel bathroom. The most uncomfortable nap in the history of naps. This 2.5-year-old would rather sleep with his feet on a toilet than repent and say sorry, right? This is just the human experience. Now, I want to ask you a question, though. As parents, Nicole and I, if we had just let that go, would we have been good parents? And I would suggest to you, no. We can't just let that slide. It's a violation of all sorts of things. It's a violation of house rules. We don't punch each other. It's a violation of both his mother and I's core vision about our family, about what we're about what we're trying to build. It's a violation of our character as parents. And it's a violation of what we want. We don't want a son to grow up and punch babies. It's a bad thing. That's not what we want. So, that's why we had to intervene. And in a very real way, this is what God is doing with humanity. There are certain things that God just will not let slide. Not because he's mean, but because of love. And not because he's cruel, but because he wants to build a particular family in a particular way. He wants humans to become a certain type of people, to bear his image. And baby punching is not it. Isaiah 9 says this, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." And then the next two verses, which may or may not be familiar, get real thorny real quick. Because it's about Dad, King, God, saying, I'm not letting that slide. And this is what it says. "For to us a child is born." This is about the Messiah, about Jesus. "To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. And the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." This is what Isaiah writes 800 years before Jesus was even born. So we need to talk about some terms here, because this passage is filled with them. First, let's talk about the word government. This is the only place in the Old Testament this particular word is used. It's the word Mizrah, and it means a rule, a reign, or dominion. It's of a king. See, the idea here is this is not about a political party. This is not about which political party or candidate is God's candidate or party, a situation that we seem to talk about every 4 years. This is about God as king. And in the ancient world and everywhere, even now, kings have particular reigns, which means a way of doing things. It's a culture of reigning. And this culture of reigning, every king, comes from their internal character. You got an evil king, you're going to have an evil reign. You got a good king, you're going to have a good reign. That's just the way it works. It flows out of who the king is. And God has a particular type of reign, a particular type of government. This is about God as king. By government, I mean a reign, a way of doing things. N.T. Wright's commentary on Mark is titled, I love this, "How God Became King." And this is what's going on. In the book of Genesis, humans as image bearers are given dominion over the world, the same word that you kind of look at here with the government and reign and dominion, to rule it as co-regents with God. But we are not the king. We're not the king. God is. We're his ambassadors or representatives. Whose dominion is it? It's God's, and he shares it with his image bearers. And we are supposed to rule with his character, like him. This is the whole point of this. We're supposed to even make more image bearers. The demand to make more children in Genesis, to go and make more children, is not just about procreation. It's about making more faithful covenant partners with God who bear his image and bear his character. But whose dominion is it? It is not ours. It's God's. Jesus even says something very similar about this government. He says, all authority, all reign under heaven and earth has been given to me, Jesus says. So that's what that word government means. It's the reign of God, Jesus in particular. But then it says his reign, his government, and his peace. We need to talk about the word peace. Peace is a word that we use all the time. But biblical peace is very rich and deep. This word peace is the Hebrew word shalom. It's used 237 times in the Old Testament. It is a massive theme in the Old Testament. And peace, The way I think about it and the way it's been described to me is that peace is this way and this way and this way. Basically, it's right with God, right with others in our relationship, and even right with ourselves in the entire of creation. This is what biblical peace or shalom is. It's right relationships or relationships made whole. This is what God wants to bring. This and this and this and this. But then Isaiah continues, the government in his peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne, upholding it with justice and righteousness. And now we come to two words, which are two of my favorite words in the entire Old Testament. If you've been around me, you know that I wrote one of my seminary dissertations on this, justice and righteousness, righteousness and justice, tzedakah and mishpat. I want to talk about these words because these words are very confusing. We don't use them a lot. In fact, I'm of a certain age where when I think of the word righteous, think of Keanu Reeves in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Righteous, dude. That dates me. How many of you over here, middle schoolers in high school, got that reference? You did? Praise and bless you. I love you. Unbelievable. I thought that was going to go over everyone's head. Okay, great. Bill and Ted's. Maybe check it out. Keanu Reeves. He's amazing. Anyway, righteousness is the word tzedakah. It's used 159 times in the Old Testament. And justice is the word mishpat. It's used 149 times in the Old Testament. And here's the thing. More often than not, almost always, these two words are used together. They're used, now, not to be weird, but I'm a former English teacher. The grammatical word for this is hendias. Hendias means two together. It's like peanut butter and jelly or AirPods. You can't have a left AirPod and a right. You need them both for the full sound. Just like peanut butter and jelly, they go together. Have you ever had a peanut butter sandwich? No, that's gross. You might as well eat sawdust. And a jelly sandwich, that's just insane. You need an insulin shot afterwards. Don't do it. Peanut butter and jelly, though, that's the deal. That's the ticket. So this word, justice and righteousness, this hendias, they go together. So let's talk about what they are. Righteousness. Let me explain what righteousness is. Righteousness, the word tzedakah, the root word in Hebrew is tzedek, which means straight, which means not crooked. The accurate weights and measures in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, when you give accurate weights and measures when you're measuring grain, are called measures of tzedek, which means they're straight, they're accurate, they're not crooked. Safe paths for sheep in shepherding in the Psalms, in Psalm 23, are called paths of tzedek, which means they're straight paths. This refers to human image bearers who are straight or in the right order. They're not crooked in their relationships to God or with each other. Primarily, this has first it has to do with our relationship with God, but then secondarily, flowing out of that is a relationship in the social order. Remember, Jesus doesn't really separate the idea of having a right relationship with God and right with others. He says, if you're right with God, you will be right with others. Remember, he says, the first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, mind, strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. These are connected. These are together. That's righteousness. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project defined righteousness this way. This might be helpful to someone. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God. Alec Moitier, who is also a commentator, wrote this. He said, righteousness, this is his definition, right with God, and therefore committed to putting right all other relationships in life. That might help you. That's what righteousness is. And if it sounds a lot like peace, you aren't too far off. Justice, however, is a slightly different word. Justice is the word mishpat. It means treating people fairly or equitably. And it's not just individual or personal in the social realm. It's actually bigger. It's about systems. For example, the Israelites are commanded to acquit or punish every person on the merits of the case legally, regardless of race or social status. They must be tzedek. Mishpat. This is what mishpat is. It has to be fair this way. This is called mishpat. Another example of mishpat is the priests who run the temple and therefore cannot farm because they're busy running the temple are to be supported by the rest of the people, the other tribes of Israel. They are to be given their food from the other tribes. This is called their due or their mishpat. And that's in Deuteronomy 18. And in general, Special attention is given to the weakest members of society, widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor, because when it comes to the application of fairness, those are the ones who are most often exploited. An example from Zechariah. And this is all over, this quartet of the vulnerable, widows, orphans, immigrants, the poor, this mantra, that is repeated again and again and again and again, because these are the groups that are most often at experience injustice at the hands of others. Zechariah 7, and the word of the Lord came to Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another, and do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner, the immigrant, or the poor. This is what God says justice is. There's a famous line also in the prophet Amos. The prophets often speak of justice and righteousness because this is a violation not just of this, but of this. And if it's violated here, then it's because we don't get this right. And Amos says this. He says to the people who are worshiping, and this is shocking. He says, away with the noise of your songs. God says, this is God speaking, I will not listen to the music of your harps. You come to church, you sing, I'm not even going to listen to you. Why? Because of this. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. The Israelites have neglected justice and righteousness, and God's like, I don't even want to come to your assemblies. I'm not going to listen to your praises. I'm not going to listen to your prayers until you get this right. Later on, Jesus would say, if you come to the temple and you have wronged your brother, leave the worship service and go find your brother. That's more important to God, because the violation of justice and righteousness is so critical. Later on in American history, this line from Amos was famously said at one of the most famous speeches in American history, by Martin Luther King Jr. at the I Have a Dream speech. He quotes Amos, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. He's talking about the injustice of racial inequality in the United States of America, Jim Crow laws. But the point I'm trying to make here is that justice and righteousness are peanut butter and jelly. They go together. They go together. They go together. They go together. And another way to say it, this is how I think of it. This might be helpful for you. It might not be. Righteousness, as I think about it, is I love what's right and I do what's right. In justice, I set things right when they're broken. As far as I can, as far as it is up to me, I try to partner with God to help set things right. I can't always do it, but I can try. So in a real way, so this is where it gets a little tricky. If everyone practiced righteousness, do you see? There would be no need for justice. Do you see? In a real way, if everyone were righteous, with the exception of like accidental things, there would be no need for justice. It would all be done. We'd just do it. And this is how it works everywhere in the world. Except it never does. We violate righteousness all the time. And so as a result of this. So why should we pursue righteousness? This is fascinating to me. The book of Proverbs is about wisdom, and one of the major themes is pursuing righteousness and justice. Mostly righteousness, because they say if you get this right, the other stuff won't need to be broken. It won't need to be fixed if we get righteousness right. So why should we practice justice and righteousness? Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, to profit self. In Proverbs 21:21, the author writes, whoever pursues righteousness and love finds life, prosperity, and honor. There's an incentive here for those who seek righteousness. Secondly, righteousness actually promotes a relationship with God. This is really important. Yahweh says, I detest the way of the wicked, but he loves those who pursue righteousness. God actively sets his face against those who actually do not pursue justice and righteousness. But if you're trying to pursue justice and righteousness, God will set his face toward you. He will help you. This is how we have a right relationship with God. It's a big deal. And then lastly, and this feels incredibly weird to us modern Americans who only think about ourselves and our household, the idea here is that justice and righteousness, pursuing righteousness, actually helps or exalts the community. Proverbs 14, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any person. The idea is that if you are righteous and you love what's right and do what's right, it's good for everybody in your entire social circle. Everybody. It's good news for everybody. So, what's the opposite of justice and righteousness? The Bible has a word for this. Does anyone actually know what this word is? It's actually the title of the most popular movie in the world right now. Wicked! There it is. Great film. Have you seen this? Have you guys seen this? Ariana Grande is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So good. Anyway, but like wicked is this word, we're making fun of it, right? The wicked witch. But honestly, this word wicked is really important biblically. But I don't think we kind of understand what this word wicked means. It's not about being green or Ariana Grande. Here's actually the definition of wicked. This is from one of my favorite humans in the world, my seminary professor and my cohort advisor, Gary Brashears, who was a monstrous mentor and influence on me. He had a definite, this is me and him, that's me in a salmon shirt. It's not pink. It makes my eyes pop. He has a definition of wickedness. This is what he says. He says, the wicked advantage themselves by disadvantaging others, but the righteous disadvantage themselves to advantage others. Let me read that again, because this is all through Proverbs and all through the Old Testament. The wicked. So which one is Jesus, right? Do you see? Do you see how much he disadvantaged himself to serve others? He left heaven. Paul later on in Corinthians looks at the church of Corinth and says, consider how poor Christ became for your sake, and then out of that give generously to those in need. Paul wants us to think about this, to meditate on this, how much Jesus disadvantaged himself for the benefit of others. And the opposite of that is a wicked person who just takes and takes and takes and does not care. So, that's what wicked is. So justice and righteousness are what is the goal. It's what God is. It's who his character is. We love what's right, we do what's right, and we set things right. But what happens when we, as humans, encounter when something is broken, when something is unjust, wrong, wicked? We want to try to set things right. But here's the problem. Sometimes humans do this in a way that actually sets things wrong, because they violate the truth that justice and righteousness must go together. An example from last week or the week before. I don't know if you saw the news, but there was a gunman who actually gunned down the CEO of United Healthcare and shot him in what the police are saying is a brazen targeted attack. It was an execution on the street. Now, what happened after this was pretty shocking. This gunman killed a CEO of a healthcare provider because he wanted to set things right. He was after justice, but I would submit to you that though he was trying for justice, he completely violated the righteousness aspect. Murder is not righteous. You never get justice by violating righteousness. Now, what's crazy about this, or what's very difficult, is that there's such a grave, and again, look, I am not an expert on the United States healthcare system. I don't have doctorates on it. I've never studied it. There's complexities that I don't understand. I did a deep dive, and I tried to study and learn, but I don't know a lot. So I'm speaking a little out of my depth here. But here's what I do know. The online reaction was pretty shocking to me. I have a family member, a dear family member, who I love, who said the following to me in a text. Sometimes a bullet is our only option for justice. And I gotta say, that is unrighteous. This person really needs the Christian moral imagination of Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent resistance. They need Jesus as a model exemplar. And yet, I understand the anger. For example, the front page of the New York Times this week said, there's a torrent of hate for health insurance industry follows the CEO's killing. If you've been following online, people are outraged and sharing story after story of grave injustice. And again, I don't know a ton about what's going on here, but there's a lot going on. For example, people are pointing to the fact that right now there's a legal case where United Healthcare is actually in litigation for using AI to deny Medicare claims. I mean, they're just, and then this chart was circulating around social media. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a chart of the percentage of claims denied by various insurance companies. And United Healthcare is at 32% of all claims. And I get it. I get where people are upset. It reminds me, have you guys ever seen The Incredibles? Remember that film, The Incredibles? Bob Parr, Mr. Incredible. Do you remember what he works for, his job? An insurance company. And what is his turn toward hero? He begins helping people navigate the complexities of the healthcare industry. This is his turn. I understand the frustration and the injustice. But here's what's interesting to me. This was a graph taken by a percentage. This is a percentage of people who say the United Healthcare CEO killing was acceptable or somewhat acceptable. And 41% of people 18 to 29 said, 41% said it's acceptable or somewhat acceptable. I understand the anger. I understand the injustice. Like that, we're not trying to gloss over that. We're talking about the method to set it right. And this is where we are. Justice without righteousness and righteousness without justice is not the way of Christ. It's not the way of the Bible. Justice without righteousness is vengeance. It's retribution without reconciliation. There is a death of a human being who is now gone. His family mourns, and it did not accomplish what the person set out to accomplish. And yet, righteousness without justice, that's empty. That's false religiosity without true sacrificial love. If you just gloss over the injustice, if you don't pay attention to it. Here's the thing that's difficult about this. In my experience, the world, the secular world, most often has justice without righteousness. They seek justice, but they do it in ways that violate righteousness. But here's the difficult part. The church has historically often done righteousness without justice. And that's equally egregious. They go together. They go together. They go together. In thinking about this, Jay Kim and I sat down and we wrote a series of meditative questions just for ourselves. And we realized how complex this is. There's a personal side, there's a social side, there's a family side. So Jay and I sat down, we wrote 4 questions. We tried to word them carefully. And here's what I realized as I was going through this with some friends and some family. Of these 4 questions I'm about to go through, 3 of them probably won't even relate to you. You won't even be able to access them. One of them you might. Because all of us tend to swing toward justice or righteousness, that we just do. Some folks in here are really attuned to injustice. Some folks here are really attuned to righteousness. And so I'm going to read these questions, and I just want you to pray over them and see if any of them hit you or hit your heart. Is there a specific relationship in your life where getting even because of real hurt matters more to you than reconciliation? And I'm not excusing the hurt. I'm not saying that what the person did was not egregious. I'm saying is getting even more important to you than even the possibility of reconciliation. If so, I think we should invite God in. Is there an issue of systemic societal brokenness where vengeance matters more to you than healing? Is there a specific relationship in your life where self-justification, proving that you're right, matters more to you than the self-sacrifice it would take to make things right? Or is there an issue of systemic societal brokenness where you're more motivated to make a point than to make a difference? I see this a lot online as well. The point is, justice without righteousness and righteousness without justice is completely incomplete. But as the biblical model shows, as Jesus shows, as Advent shows, that justice with righteousness, tzedakah and mishpat, causes sacrificial, reconciling love to operate. Now, here's the difficult part about this. Who can accomplish this? Often humans don't. In our own brokenness, we often violate these. We violate righteousness and we violate justice. So who can do this? Who can bring these two together? And the answer is God can. Isaiah 9, again, I want to remind you of whose idea this is. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. Who's going to do it? The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Who's most passionate about tzedakah and mishpat? It's God himself. And here's the crazy thing. We have a story in our collective imagination that shows the power of God entering into a human life and heart and bringing about justice and righteousness, not with bullets, but with a transformed heart. It's in our collective story. It's in our collective imagination, and it has been since you were a kid. It's the story of this man, Ebenezer Scrooge. Please tell me you've seen Christmas Carol. Not just Bill and Ted's. How many of you have seen Christmas Carol know what I'm talking about when I say Ebenezer Scrooge? All right, how many of you Bill and Ted's? Okay. That should be at least equal. If you haven't heard this story, let me tell you. The story of a Christmas Carol is the story of a man named Ebenezer Scrooge, where we get the term Scrooge. And he is a miserable human who, by biblical definitions, is actually quite wicked. He's wealthy, but dramatically underpays his employee Bob Cratchit an unfair wage. Or a fair wage, but is very underpaid. He hoards his money, giving none to charity, even good causes. He mercilessly hounds people who owe him money. He doesn't even pay for coal or wood to heat his office, even though, because he's not required to, even though it makes his employee, Bob Cratchit, freeze. And perhaps most telling, there's a telling exchange when some men come from a charity to raise money. Now, in Dickens' time in England, if someone were to fail to pay their bill or fall behind in bills, they would be imprisoned in a work prison called a workhouse or a debtor's prison. Dickens' own father was seized from his home and put in a debtor's prison for 10 years. And Dickens himself had to go and work and labor at a shoe factory in order to earn money. This is where Dickens got this from. And these two men come to Scrooge and they are raising money because in a workhouse, the men work all day, but they only make pennies on the dollar. So it's very difficult to get out of debtor's prison. So these two men are raising money to get men out of prison, back in their families, and to give them warm meals. And Scrooge looks at them and says, no, it's a waste of money. And he says, quote, it would be better if a man in that situation, quote, died and decreased the surplus population. This is what he says. And then you know the story. What happens? Does someone come and put a bullet in Scrooge's brain? No, they do not. He is visited by three transcendent creatures, three ghosts, the ghost of Christmas past and present and future. The Trinity, three. Dickens knows what he's doing. He is visited by these three angels in hopes that they might change him. And they show him his future, they show him his present, they show him his past. And in one of the most chilling moments in the entire book or play, there's this moment where the ghost of Christmas present, who is ruthless to Scrooge, quotes his own words back at him. He goes to Bob Cratchit's house and he sees Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim is very sick. And all of a sudden, Scrooge is seized with, oh my gosh, this guy might die. And he says, tell me, ghost of Christmas present, look into the future and tell me, does he live? And the ghost of Christmas present says, no, he does not. But it's fine because he just decreases the surplus population. Quoting Scrooge's words right back. And in that moment, Scrooge falls on his face and weeps and repents. And you know the story. He wakes up, realizes what has happened, and he is a changed man. And the first mark of his change is generosity and repaired relationships. He goes to Cratchit's house. He buys the biggest goose. He goes and he is a changed man. He begins giving his considerable wealth strategically to charity that impacts. He is a changed man. Justice and righteousness together. God changes. And in the words of a man who knew a little something about what it was like to be changed from wicked to righteous, the Apostle Paul, who was a murderer, wrote this. In Romans 6, knowing this, our old man was crucified with him, and that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul writes, if anyone's in Christ, a new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here. And in Ezekiel 36, the prophet writes, God says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you, and remove from your heart the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. God does this work. But it's not just God. Like, who does it? Does God do it, or do we participate with God? It's like, which blade of the scissors is more important? It's a dumb question. Yes. God moves and work, and we can respond to him and work and partner with him. And again, what's the vision here? Isaiah 9, of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He's going to reign on David's throne. He will establish and uphold it with justice and righteousness. It's a lot. And Christmas can get pretty sentimental. And we can lose the fact that God came to set things right. And it cost him a lot. And he's offering us a chance to partner with him. I want to close with this. I want to close with a story of a dear friend of mine. He's in my men's group, our Bible study, and our men's group. This is Ryan Brauer. He's also on staff with me. This picture, I love this picture. It makes it look like he's a country music album or something. I don't know. Ryan, this past Thanksgiving, took 30 folks, dozens of families, down to a place that we have partnered with at Westgate called Rancho Santa Marta. It's an orphanage. Some of you have probably already gone. In fact, in April, we're going with our students there. We're going to take them there. I've been there multiple times with our students. This is the group that Ryan led, all the families, all the kids. And this Rancho Santa Marta, which Westgate has supported for years, was founded on the predication of a couple things. Number one, that there are some people in this community for whom no one will care for. Mostly special needs kids with Down syndrome. They are literally dropped off at the dump and left by their families that cannot or will not support them. And so they're left at the dump. And so this orphanage came and said, you're not trash. You're not. You're ours. You're our kids. And they build homes, one for boys, one for girls. And they have lovingly served these young men and young women, and they will serve them until their adulthood, all through their adulthood, because that's what they'll do. Not because they will become productive members of society, but because they're made in the image of God. And that's what this orphanage does. They put broken things back together. But it goes even further than that. They also started a home for children who have been abandoned or abused to the point where the government has taken them away from their homes. And so in the middle of this, they have some orphanages, some houses, one for men, or one for young boys and one for young girls. And in this home for young boys and young girls are people, kids, young people who've been taken away, who have suffered horrific abuse. And Ryan was telling me that on this trip there was a doctor and a nurse, and the orphanage asked them, will you do some medical exams? We don't have a lot of doctors come through. Can you just do some checks for all of our kids, just to make sure everything's okay, and do some family history and some medical history? And so they agreed. And they found something, pretty tough. In the house with the girls, the 13 and 14 and 15-year-old girls, they found a history, just a pattern of urinary tract infections and bedwetting. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. Like, what was happening with these girls? And as they listened to the girls' stories, they told them that when they were younger, when they would get up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, they'd be assaulted. And they didn't feel safe. So they would just stay in their beds all night, afraid, seized with terror. On Thanksgiving Day, Ryan and a bunch of the families cooked Thanksgiving dinner, and they got to talking, and they found out these girls, they love soccer. But the boys across the way, they always say, we're better. But some of the girls on the trip, they play varsity soccer, and they're like, oh, it's on. And they played a Thanksgiving game of soccer. And I will not hesitate to tell you, those girls won. And they won handily. And as these girls were running around, Ryan looked at our kids and those girls running and laughing and in joy. And he just fell on his face and he started crying and he said, God's healing these girls because they're safe. And the number of urinary tract infections is going down because they're healing. And look, I know this world is dark, but I got to say this to you. In the middle of grave injustice, the righteousness of God is winning in that place because of faithful covenant partners with God who are working with God to love what's right, to do what's right, and when it's possible to partner with God to help set things right. This is justice and righteousness. And this is why God has come to earth. This is what he's about. To move crying into laughter, to change weeping into rejoicing, mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, despair into hope, brokenness into healing, fear into courage, weakness into strength, pain into peace, sorrow into joy, darkness into light, and death into life. This is what God does. This is what he's about. And we have the opportunity this Christmas and this year with our lives to partner with him. This is the message of Christmas. This is the invitation. And it starts by us staring at what God has done for us. So we stand with me as we worship the King of Kings, who will reign and the government will be on his shoulders. And of the justice and righteousness of his kingdom, there will be no end. This is the promise, and this is the invitation. Let's stand and worship.